All right, welcome back to Yin and Yang, the podcast. We are here with special guest Peter Kageyama. Thank you so much for joining us. Yay.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. So Peter is a author. He's known for such works as For the Love of For the Love of Cities. Am I saying that correct? For the Love of Our Cities. Yeah.
For the love of
And
cities.
For the Love of Cities, sorry. And which is also the his nonfiction website, which you can visit to see some of his previous talks and his works on that, where he talks about urban development and for people falling in love with their cities and writing love notes to their cities. He's currently on a book tour, a virtual book tour of his book called Hunter's Point, and which stars Katz Takemoto, a private a PI, private investigator, who's tasked with research, looking into some not so nice things that are happening over in the Hunters Point area, which is
Set in the late 50s
late
in San
in the
Francisco.
late 50s in San Francisco. Cool. Sorry, anything I miss in that intro? Anything?
No, it's very
Yeah.
good. So yeah, Katz is a Nisei. And obviously it was and Hunters Point is a real place in San Francisco.
Yeah.
There that's got its own very sordid history as well. So
Right, and it's still, yeah, I that area, I just because we're both we have both lived in the Bay Area, Dan and I,
yeah.
and I mean I'm from the Bay Area. I grew up there, and I know San Francisco. That was like a place you don't go. It's still you still don't really go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because of
Um,
the history. There's also that kind of like dark history of like the radioactive waste, and that was that not many people like that was pretty much covered up, I think, by the government.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was like I said, it has an incredibly sordid past. There's a friend of mine is a well-known author on the West Coast from San Francisco. He described Hunters Point, he described Bayview Heights as the Mordor of San Francisco.
Okay.
You're Tolkien, you'd get the reference, but you're absolutely right. It is an environmental disaster there. It was a naval base. It was the Bayview Heights neighborhood was the home of like all of the dirtiest industries for a couple hundred years. The slaughterhouses were there. There was a coal plant, energy plant, there, and just like bad stuff. And because it was mostly immigrants and then African Americans. And it's like that was the area. It's like, okay, yeah, let's dump all that stuff in there, including dragging a radioactive aircraft carrier after the Bikini Atoll tests in the South Pacific after World War II. They dragged a radioactive aircraft carrier back and parked it at Hunters Point Naval Yard for several years. What could go wrong?
So yeah, before we do a deep dive into your current novel, let's get a little bit. Let's find out a little bit about your background, who you are, where did you grow up? I know your father. He was actually he's a Japanese American, or he's from Japan, or is he?
No, Dad was a Nisei. I was
He's a
born in San
Nisei. Sorry,
Francisco. Yeah.
got it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm a Sansei, but I was born in Akron, Ohio. And my dad married a redheaded Irish woman from Ohio. And I grew up in Akron, Ohio, and there was nobody who looked like me there. And very few Asian faces, and it was definitely a different sort of upbringing. And San Francisco holds a very special place in my heart because that was the first place I ever went to. My dad took me there when I was like a sophomore in high school because he wanted to show me where he was from. And we went to San Francisco, and I looked around and go, oh my God, there's people who look like me. In fact, a lot of people who look like me. It was revelatory, at that time. But yeah, so it was, I'm a Midwestern boy at heart there, Ohio State, and now live in Florida for about the last almost 30 years now.
Awesome. Yeah. And growing up in Ohio, uh, did you, because like not many people look like you, did you face much racism at all, or?
Yeah, I mean, people made fun of me. They made fun of my name, because you look a little different there. And I mean, comparatively speaking, the stories I've heard from other, friends and other people, it's like I got off very easy. But yeah, it was there, and I was conscious of it. But I was also, I grew pretty big. I'm 6'2". yeah, I didn't get picked on that much. I did study martial arts because I was
Oh,
required. If
nice.
you're an Asian kid, you had to study martial arts at some point there. And yeah, so I think my experience with it was, yes, it was there, but I think my experience compared to the way, you know, many other people's was very, very mild. I was very lucky in that sense.
Sorry,
So,
side
what,
tangent, but
what,
yeah,
yeah,
sorry, go ahead. I know
martial
what Dan's
arts.
gonna ask.
Okay.
What martial arts did you study?
I started out with a little Chinese Kung Fu
Okay.
at first, but then I moved into kickboxing. And then by the time I got into college, I was studying Nimpo Taijutsu there with my teacher. So yeah, a little bit of modern stuff, a little bit more traditional Japanese stuff as well.
And how long did you study at Nippon Taijutsu?
I got to a 3rd degree black belt.
Oh, very nice.
You know.
And then
Nippon Tai.
what style of Kung Fu did you study?
Hmm.
It was like a mixed bag of stuff. My teacher was actually the father of one of the other Asian kids in school. His name was David Han, and he knew Tai Chi, but he also knew like some Qigong, and like I think it was mostly like no, I want to say Northern style Kung Fu. There was no. I studied for about a year and a half with him. You
Right.
know, just enough to learn enough of the basics and realize I kind of was more interested, I think, in kickboxing at that time.
Hmm.
You know, you're young, you want
Right.
to, you know, yeah, that felt more appropriate at the time.
And then
So,
being Sansei, did did your dad have any like cultural ties to Japan? The Nisei, I know it's like it starts to go farther and
yeah,
farther away from Japan.
yeah, my dad went to Japan twice, only twice. There, he was born in San Francisco. He went to a Japanese school as a kid there, and my whole family was interned. And then after the war, my family didn't go back to San Francisco. They went, and mostly they stayed in Chicago. And then one of my aunts also moved to Washington D.C. My dad goes to school in Chicago, and eventually goes to work for Firestone. And moves to Akron, Ohio, because Akron is the rubber capital of the world.
Hmm.
There as well. But dad wanted to go back to Japan, and he did twice. And I remember he told me, he goes, you know, I went back to Japan. He says immediately, he said, folks knew I was not Japanese, or
Right.
I was not from there, just by
Right.
looking at me. He said he didn't even have to open his mouth. Of course, you know, he spoke Japanese, but he spoke American Japanese
Right.
in that sense. And it was so, yeah, he had this, it was an interesting kind of conversation, because he realized even though he, you know, he looked at the part, he was definitely, you know, an outsider. And I think
Yeah.
and you know, that's very characteristic of, you know, of Japanese society. You know, you know, it's a closed society. They're very gracious, very welcoming, but you know, yeah, it is who we are. And then there's the rest of, you know, the rest of the world. So yeah.
Right.
What about yourself? Have you gone back to Japan?
Once, I was just talking about this with James, because I know he's in the Osaka area. I was an exchange student in high school to Japan, and I was in the Osaka area there. And I was supposed to go back. My wife and I were supposed to go back for the Tokyo Olympics.
Oh, yeah.
That got pretty sideways there.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, that all got botched up. But we will. It is on the agenda. We will go back to Japan. I'm very much looking forward to that.
Are you still in contact with any relatives back in Japan?
No, unfortunately not. My dad had a distant cousin who he was friends with, who has since passed. And yeah, I know a few things. You know, I know my grandfather is buried in Chigasaki. But yeah, unfortunately, I have lost those connections.
Hmm. So your grandparents are from the Chigasaki area, or?
Yeah, Chigasaki, Yokohama. Yeah, they were Issei. They came over in the early 1920s. And
Hmm.
their 3 children were all born here in the States, in San Francisco.
Yeah. So then your grandparents and your parents then were all interned then.
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay.
Topaz in Utah.
Okay.
Yeah, March 1942,
Hmm.
evacuation, executive order 9066,
Yeah.
Japanese exclusionary zone. Yes. So, yeah.
I know you've mentioned in previous interviews how like that was kind of not really a big talking point you had with your father, even though it was a big part of his, you know, life.
It was
And yeah.
my dad's generation. They didn't talk about that stuff. Dad would make these casual sort of offhand remarks, because I mean, I knew about what happened. I knew about camp. And he'd say, "Oh yeah, back in camp, something happened," or I met these were my friends in camp, or there was, it was just in camp. But he never really dug into that. And he was very reserved, very kind man, but he was not, very talkative, not very emotional. And he never really opened up about that stuff. And so writing about this stuff, this character who went through this, was sort of a way, I think, of having a conversation with my dad that I never actually could when he was alive.
Do you feel like maybe that was that a cultural thing, or was it that he was ashamed of the time at camp? Or
Well,
yeah,
absolutely. I think it's both. I think it was actually sort of characteristic of that there was shame about that there were protests. There were the no boys, the ones who wouldn't the oath and whatnot. And there were protests, and there was things that were taken to all the way to the Supreme Court there. But I think there was something about the experience that my dad's generation, they felt kind of ashamed that it happened to them, and then they just didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to move past it, sort of put it behind them, and that's unfortunate that, that many of the stories, that now have to be sort of unearthed and sort of realized by, the Sansei and the Yonsei, the third and fourth generation, kids of these folks, because it explains a lot of things about that generation and why they why they were the way they were. Like I said, my dad was pretty closed off about a lot of things, except I will say this, that the friends he made in camp were lifelong friends. I'm named after one of his best friends who he met in camp, Peter Matsumoto. And his other best friend was named Masa Takatoshi. And when I actually created this character for this book, Hunter's Point, his name is Katz Takemoto. And I took those two names of my father's best friends and brought them together there. So it was a bonding experience, but it was also, it was a very challenging experience. It was, very complex. And in some ways it was very good for them, but in other ways it was very, emotionally scarring as well.
Yeah, I know.
Did you ever meet your grandparents?
Yeah.
Yes. Several times. My dad's parents, they came over several times. And my grandmother lived to be 98.
Wow.
There, yeah, she passed. She came after my grandfather died. They actually went back to Japan in the 1950s, which is interesting story there. But they came back and visited multiple times. Then after my grandfather passed away, my grandmother really couldn't take care of herself in the home, so they ended up selling the home, and she moved over here to the United States, and she actually ended up living with my aunt, the eldest daughter, there. And yeah, she lived to be close to 100. And I got to hang out with her. I got to spend, more time with her. My Japanese was not very good. Her English was not very good, but we smiled and nodded our heads a lot. So,
yeah. I think language is definitely, especially for like immigrant children, or you probably saw from like the trailer I did for my short film, that was a big inspiration for that short film, was like, how can you connect with older generations? There's the generational gap, but there's also that huge linguistic gap, different language, right? Yeah. So as far as your, go ahead.
I didn't grow up speaking Japanese. My dad never spoke it at home. I had to go to college to learn Japanese. And so I feel like I missed out on something. And I think that was part of, the goal was to assimilate, fit in, and by doing that, you didn't speak, Japanese. My dad really didn't make, Japanese food. We had a couple, we had, mochi on New Year's, but that was about the extent of our cultural, heritage, as it were. So I mean, did you guys, did you grow up speaking, your parents or your grandparents' language?
I actually grew up speaking Japanese because my mom grew up in Japan, and then early on we lived with my grandparents, so I spoke Mandarin as well. But that was like the second language.
Okay.
Yeah.
And my grandparents helped raise me, so they didn't speak English. So my first languages were like Taiwanese, which is it's I guess it's very unintelligible to Mandarin. It's considered a dialect just because it doesn't have a military power. But like, I spoke a little bit of Mandarin and Taiwanese with my grandparents, and then at age 5 I was speaking gibberish. So my parents were like, "Okay, let's speak English at home. We're living in America, James." Yeah. So then I lost those. So I had to relearn Mandarin as an adult. So I can speak Mandarin now. I'm learning Japanese now because I'm So yeah, my family is from Taiwan. So yeah, I do think and you might have felt this too, Peter, like relearning a language, it's kind of like reconnecting with your family. It's like talking, it's reconnecting with an old family member, that language. Like I remember hearing these words, but I didn't know how to use it in context,
My grandmother lived long enough that my Japanese was at least rudimentary. And when, I get to see her, then when I was in college, I think it pleased her a lot that I at least made the attempt. That was a good time. So yeah, I appreciate it.
That's great.
Did your aunt, since she helped take care of her grandmother, did she speak, or did she like cook Japanese food?
Both of my aunts did. Actually, it's funny, the eldest aunt, she just turned 100 last year.
Wow.
Fortunately, she has dementia, and so she's not present, but she's 100 years old. The women in my family apparently quite long lived there. But the two, my dad was the youngest child, and he had a middle sister as well. They both passed there. But though the two aunts actually they had a bit more of a connection to Japanese heritage. I think partly because they girl children learned to cook in that generation. Right. Male children didn't necessarily do that. So my dad couldn't rub two sticks together, stuff like that. But my aunts were good cooks, and of course the Japanese food was part of the rota, I guess. So yeah, they made it happen. Food is important. Yeah.
Yes, it's just a way to it's one way to pass traditions or cultural things from one generation to the next. And then did your aunts marry Caucasians, or did they marry Japanese, or?
They married Japanese. So it was my dad was the rebel in the family, I guess. He married the redheaded Irish woman from Ohio. And yeah, both my aunts married also Nisei men there. So but then of course, the sansei, their children pretty much all married, Caucasians. So there's, so now the next generation, they all kind of look like me. So I'd like to think I was ahead of the curve. So.
And do you have siblings?
Oh yeah.
Do you have siblings?
I have a half sister from my mom's second marriage. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I was just curious because if you had siblings growing up in Akron, Ohio, there would be at least somebody else who looked like you.
No, I was the lone one in the wilderness, as it were. And you didn't fit into. There were a few Asian kids, and my first girlfriend was actually James. My first girlfriend was Taiwanese. So
interesting.
There's that. But yeah, you didn't realize that being mixed was an even smaller sort of slice of the pie. It was. You realize later in life, go, wow, that was kind of different. Being in a very Midwestern, very kind of a monoculture in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but when we were asking about whether we spoke our grandparents' language, my kids do not speak their grandparents' language at all. So that's like completely lost. So my mom's living with us now, and my kids actually use like a pidgin English when they speak to her, thinking that it helps with the explanations, but it really doesn't.
No. Well, isn't that how most Americans, when they travel overseas, they speak louder and slower?
Yes.
Well, that'll work, sure. Hopefully some of that, some of the grandparent, rubs off on the kids.
Yes. But then, as far as your book is concerned, how did you come up with the idea of the setting and the time period?
So the book was really a COVID project. Hopefully you guys, you get out of COVID, you had a little bit more time, and you're thinking about some different stuff. And I actually read an incredible book there in 2021 that kind of like, oh my God, I actually have it right here because I thought I'd show you guys. It was this one, Facing the Mountain by Daniel James Brown. It's an amazing story. It's about the sort of the history of Japanese Americans during World War II. And it reads like a fantastic novel. And it answered so many of the questions that, I wish I'd been able to ask my father, my grandparents as well, about life before the war, during the war, during internment, the Nisei, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the ones who fought in Europe there, and sort of the experience after that. It's like, oh my God, this is an amazing story. It's like, it's like, wow, this is a fantastic sort of background for a story. And then this idea of setting, it's like, well, what would happen with one of these guys who came back, and what would he become? Maybe become a detective, and maybe in San Francisco, because, a lot of the Nisei went back to San Francisco. And it just started to percolate. And I started to write, and I didn't tell anybody I was actually writing fiction, because I never had thought I was going to write fiction. I'm a nonfiction guy. I've got 4 books about cities. What am I doing writing about, private detectives in San Francisco? But San Francisco seemed the natural spot because of the Nisei connection. And it was also because San Francisco, I think because of my father, and San Francisco has this sort of mystique to it, right? There are certain cities that have that. You say San Francisco and you think of the fog and the water and the hills, right? You say Paris, you think of like the Eiffel Tower and the sand, London, and and places like that. They have this built-in mystique. And certainly San Francisco had that. And then in the time period, I started doing some research, and you start thinking about, well, what was going on in San Francisco in the late 50s? Because that would have been like the age when this guy would kind of come into his own. And there's really amazing stuff happening there. And the first part of the story was originally going to be set against the making of Vertigo, one of my favorite films.
Hitchcock.
Yeah, Hitchcock. It was, filmed in San Francisco in 1957. It's like, that'd be an interesting sort of like, okay, what could you do with that? And I start researching more and more and more. And Vertigo is in the book, but it's not the central theme, because I found out a bunch of other stuff, including, as we were talking about earlier, about this incredible place called Hunters Point that was a naval, base. It was, that there was radiation. There was all kinds of shenanigans that were going on there. There was all kinds of cover-ups. And it became sort of like, all right, there's a story in there, and let's set this character against this amazing backdrop with this real stuff that was happening there. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, it was a great time.
That's great. And you also, you weave in like historical figures as well, which I know can be kind of dangerous, right? Because there's a lot of people, a lot of fans of Hitchcock, a lot of fans of Jimmy Stewart and all that. Yeah. And you also have Shig Murao.
And Shig Murao. I mean, as a fan, so I have, Hitchcock makes an appearance. Jimmy Stewart plays actually a kind of an important part in the story. And then there's other folks, there's appearances by like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg, because they were, the late 50s in San Francisco was like, that was the height of the beat poetry and the beat renaissance that was going on there. So this North Beach connection that's going on there. And Shig Murao, who was a real life person who was integral to that whole beat poetry scene. He was part of the that. He wasn't a poet, wasn't a writer. He was actually the manager of City Lights bookstore. And you guys know, if you don't know San Francisco, it's like the most famous bookstore in San Francisco. And it had this great history, and Shig was a big part of it. And what made it interesting is when I discovered this, it's like, okay, Shig, Japanese American. He was a Nisei. Oh, he was interned. Oh, and then all of this, like, it's like, I think he should be in the book. And then I start researching more and more about him, and he became this really fun character to write. And in some ways, he's like the hero's sidekick there. And I love writing about him. He was a very real person. And he passed away 25 years ago. But I hope he would smile and say, wow, I'm one of the heroes in this detective story. It's like pretty cool.
Right. I didn't know about Shig until I started, doing a little bit of research about this, about your book. And it's interesting how there's all these central figures kind of like in the background, and they happen to be Asian American, and that's something I think many of us as, Asian Americans are looking for. It's like, where are these stories? Like they're there, but for some reason they're not talked about. And so I do appreciate that your book sheds light on some of these figures, these Asian American figures that probably don't get the limelight, which is a shame,
Which is a shame. it was interesting. There was Shig was part of, this, in 1957, there was this poem by Allen Ginsberg called Howl. It sort of started the whole beat poetry scene. But they published the book. City Lights was a publishing house as well. And they sold the book to an undercover cop. And Shig had the distinction of being the poor SOB who sold the book to the cop. So he gets arrested and charged with obscenity under federal law, along with Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who was the owner of City Lights. So these guys are charged with obscenity laws for publishing this book of poetry, and it's a pretty, it's a powerful poem. It's, it's famous. Look it up, there. But it's hardly obscene. But it took a federal judge to make that ruling, and Shig was part of that. That's cultural. That is important stuff. But he's kind of lost in the story, in all that. But you're right. Unearthing these little gems of our history was one of the real, things I was like, wow, this is, I'm very glad I'm doing this.
I know, because Asia. So first of all, like San Francisco and the Asian American movement, the ethnic studies movement is integral to the city of San Francisco, because essentially ethnic studies was born in San Francisco during the, I think it was San Francisco City College, I believe. There was basically there's a protest that turned violent, unfortunately, in San Francisco, and basically students were demanding for ethnic studies department, and so ethnic studies was born in San Francisco. So I do think that San Francisco Asian American history, and owes a lot to that city, to that place.
Absolutely.
We
tend to think about San Francisco as being sort of this liberal progressive bastion there. But going back and doing this research, you find out, like, in the 1950s, that wasn't always the case. And, there was still a lot of racial animus that was there. I mean, San Francisco eventually gets there, but issues, with Asian Americans, with African Americans, Hispanics, and the emerging gay population as well were real strong flashpoints that took the 50s and 60s, and it really doesn't start to sort of emerge until the 1970s and 80s as well.
So I know you did mention the No Boys and 4042nd. So have you ever read John Okada's No Boy? It's a book that he talks about a No Boy after the war and his experience. Have you ever heard of that book?
I have heard of that book, and it is one of those things that in sort of my research, like, this is something I need to read, as part of that there. So it's on the list.
Right.
So have you read it?
I've read it. It's a fascinating book. One of my favorite Asian American books, and because it shows there's different sides of the coin for nationalism, right? So I understand from the internment, there are some people who, they were bitter. And you mentioned some characters in your book hiding that bitterness, right? Of like, we should still be proud of our country, but actually inside they're like, why is our country putting us in essentially concentration camps, internment camps, right? And so this book plays the voice of that character who is incredibly angry at his country, and that's why he's a no boy. And it kind of like talks about that perspective, whereas there's the flip side of that, of nationalism, where there's the 442nd, people who are dying, literally dying for their country. They're the most decorated military regiment in the U.S. history, I believe.
That's correct.
But it's interesting though, because like if you were to make a fully ethnic, Japanese American or Asian American unit today, that would be like, no, because can't do that, because what's like that unit's going to go, they're going to die. They're going to be put to the front lines, or that's kind of like the implication. That's like kind of the racist sort of undertones of that, if you were to do that now. Could you talk a little bit about maybe about sort of that that wartime background for like your book and for your own, like how important is that to you when you were doing the research and looking into this? Like what kind of like personal connections did you find to when you were learning about No Boys or 442nd? Yeah.
What I think is interesting is I wanted to play up that there were multiple perspectives on this. The 442nd gets a lot of the sort of the attention when we're talking about, World War II and Japanese American history. That's one of the things that we all point to. It's like we're very proud of this, as we should be. They were an amazing group of young men there. But to your point, the No Boys were, in their own way, were as principled in what they felt and their response, to all that. And I tried to play that into the conversation that Katz ends up having with his father, that his father felt incredibly betrayed by the country for, doing this to the family. And he felt that, like risking his only son in something like this was something, there was conflict and there was tension about that. And I don't know specifically in my own family's experience, but my grandfather did feel the need to go back to Japan in the 50s, that he felt that the loss of dignity and the loss of station that followed, after World War II, he couldn't, it's very hard for the Japanese Americans to get jobs after, World War II, because, the face, like, you were just the enemy there. And now, we're expected to hire you. So it was, he ended up only being able to get a job in a candy factory. This is my grandfather, who's an excellent salesman. He worked for an import-export company before the war. So this sense of diminishment, I think, weighed on him. And I think that was, something, I'm sure that was, part of the challenge with my father. And my father did, he enlisted. He was part of what was called the Military Intelligence Service, which was the first school for translators. James, this is interesting for you because you're, working in Japanese language now. But the U.S. Government knew that there was a war coming with Japan. So they thought, we probably should have some people who speak the language so they can at least, listen to radio intercepts. They can, translate documents, maybe even interrogate some people and prisoners and whatnot. So they created this language school. And the first language school was there at Crissy Field down there in San Francisco there. And the first class was in place when Pearl Harbor happened. And so they ultimately moved the school to Minnesota. And my father was one of the several thousand, mostly Nisei men who went through that particular school and ended up, in the Army. Interestingly enough, Shig Murao was also in the MIS school.
Oh.
And my dad and Shig were actually about the same age. And I think it's possible they might have even run into each other at that particular school. I don't know that. I'd like to believe it, because I think that makes an incredible sort of connection that if they actually somehow knew each other, it's like, but who knows? But yeah.
Well, you kind of make them meet in the book, I guess, because I believe, Katz is, inspired by your father. Yeah.
Absolutely. Katz is sort of a superhero version of my dad. Now, my dad was never a private detective. He never rode a motorcycle. He was not in the 442nd there.
Did he know judo, though?
A little bit. But there definitely are things about, Katz is, there's elements of my father. And oddly enough, maybe not oddly enough, Molly is the female character, is a redheaded Irish woman from Ohio. My mother was Molly, a redheaded Irish woman from Ohio. It's also a fictionalized sort of version of that. And, what I always thought was amazing was how transgressive their relationship was in the early 1960s. Asian man, white woman. That was not the norm, right? I mean, there was a lot of war brides. You saw there was interracial marriage, was going on there. But there were still a lot of places where interracial marriage was illegal, according to state law. It wasn't until 1967 that all that was struck down. But again, you didn't see Asian men with Caucasian women. And so I always thought of them as very brave for doing that. Probably contributed to the fact they didn't stay together very long. I mean, a lot of challenges with that. But hey, A for effort. And I guess the thing was, they basically together long enough to have me, and I'm very grateful for that.
Did your mom's family have any issues with her marrying your dad?
My grandmother was, I was very close to my mom's mother, my grandma there, and she always liked my dad there. So I don't think there was. They knew he was a good man there. So I think there might have been some issues, but it was never anything overt. There was never any confrontations. There was nothing. There was no Thanksgiving Day
Right.
routes or anything like that. No, but no, my grandmother was a wonderful woman, and all that, and very much loved my father. So even after my parents got divorced, she was very supportive of him.
So
I know that your grandfather and your grandparents moved back to Japan. And you mentioned that your grandfather came back a couple times.
Mhm.
The language barrier is probably pretty big, but I guess it was like would there be an opportunity for someone in your family to know what it was like for him to move back to Japan, being from America after the
Yeah.
war?
That's actually part of that story comes from conversations with two of my cousins.
Okay.
I'm the youngest of all of the kids. My father was the youngest of the three
Right.
siblings, and I'm the youngest of all the kids that his two sisters had. So I have older cousins, and they do recall in this conversation about one of the reasons why that it was sort of implied there that the grandma and grandpa went back to Japan was this. They felt it was mostly my grandfather, because apparently my grandmother very much did want to stay in the United States, but she felt, it's like, well, if Shuzo is going to go back, I have to go back with him.
Right.
There. But yeah, that was a story that I learned from my cousins.
But I mean, do you know what it was like for your grandparents to be in Japan after,
Yeah, that's a
Civil
good
War?
question. I don't know. I would imagine it was very challenging. I
Yeah.
mean, Japan's
Mm.
rebuilding even in the 1950s. You're
Right.
less a decade out. There, and it's like, you were not here. You left, and now you're coming back. It's like,
Right.
I don't know. That'd be a good story.
Yeah.
Because
Interesting up around that, but yeah, you're right. I've never seen much written or much documentation about how those folks
right.
were sort of welcomed back.
Because I only imagine that thinking about how when you mentioned your dad going back and how they spotted him a mile away that he was not Japanese,
Yeah.
I was wondering what that would be like for your grandparents to go back after having been away and living in America for so long
Yeah.
and then going back.
And having the scar tissue of the war
Yes.
in all of it. That was probably very challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can only imagine those conversations and the looks that people were going to to give you. It's like, that'd be a very interesting background for a story. That's something that's like, but actually that's a good question. It's like, I will talk to the cousins about that if they had any sort of insight.
Especially the cousins of your oldest aunt who took care of your grandmother. I'm sure there was some opportunities of like, oh, this was what it was like when I first moved back, and how hard it was and things like that. I'm just curious for my own.
Oh, now I am too. But again, it's like one of those things, like that generation, those generations, they didn't talk about, the feelings. It's like, the ultimate sort of stiff upper lip,
Right.
but it's like, it may have been really difficult, but they would probably just say, and move on.
Right.
Yeah. Or like identity. Yeah. So as far as like your own personal identity growing up, I guess with a mixed background, with a diverse background, do you feel like that has influenced maybe your storytelling as well? Like, as far as yourself, like when people ask you, oh, do you consider yourself Japanese American, or you're American first, or like you probably throughout your whole life have gotten like the identity question. I guessing,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your relationship now to identity, and how does that relate to the stories that you want to tell? Yeah.
Yeah. Good question. I'm not sure I've even fully unpacked that myself.
Yeah.
There was a time when I thought I was more Asian than I probably was, because you grew up in Ohio, and it's like, again, I felt different. And then I was an exchange student to Japan, and I go to Japan and go, holy crap, I'm so American. It's not even fun. So it kind of slaps you in the face. Go, okay, then what am I? And I think I went to college and I studied Japanese, as a Japanese language minor. I think that was part of sort of that processing. and all that. Now I sort of look at myself as like, I am an example of that melting pot. I am mixed. I'm this, I am all that. And I'm very good with, and I'm very comfortable with that. The one thing that still bothers me is, you get these check boxes and like you're filling out forms and whatnot, and it gets to race. And it's like, and there's like, okay, where's the box for mixed? And there wasn't for a long time a box for mixed. So there was this thing that says other, and just to confuse people, I used to say other, like let them figure it out. Now, but to I think our credit, in like the last couple census, whatever it was, mixed as an option. It's like, good. We finally sort of, we're embracing that. So, and I do think that, this book has been a reconnection for me with I guess more of my Japanese heritage. And I'm very happy about that.
And then do you foresee more books set in this world?
Oh, absolutely. I'm probably more than 2/3 of the way through the sequel.
Oh, very cool.
I love writing about these characters, and I couldn't wait to get back to seeing where they go next. And San Francisco in the late 50s and into the 60s, like, did anything interesting happen in San Francisco in the 60s? Like, yeah. What a rich backdrop to sort of play against, there, and to tell some interesting stories with some humor there. And and I'm finding some ways to incorporate more of those real people, but I definitely feel like that there's an Asian perspective to that history that hopefully we can tell in a not sort of beating over the head kind of way, but bringing some of those characters like a Shig Murao, more to the forefront of our sort of collective history.
Yeah, I just looked up. Yeah, in the late 60s, the term Asian American was actually born out of the SF State. I mentioned SF State Ethnic Studies program, which was like they fought for that program, the Ethnic Studies program at SF State. So yeah, good. So San Francisco is definitely a very interesting spot during that time. Yeah.
Well, and again, what we're the beats become the hippies. The emergence of the gay community to the forefront of this, all this sort of interweaves together. Yeah, and what a really interesting time that would have been.
For yourself, like, what is kind of like the transition for you, like going from nonfiction to fiction? Because I know you've been you're known as the Love for Cities guy, right? Like, I mean,
City Love guy,
City Love guy, which is, that's not a bad label. That's great,
a great label, yeah. And that's been my gig for the last dozen years or so. And I continue to do that work. I travel, I do talks, I do workshops. There, I suspect there probably will be another book in the future, but right now it's sort of like there's this competing thing there. And there's an old adage that says you are what you think about. Right now, I'm thinking a lot more about the fiction side than I am necessarily about the nonfiction side. But it is interesting because I do get asked those questions a lot. I'm consulting with a few different clients still on city issues there. So it's kind of I'm fine with it right now. I think it's actually kind of good. It keeps both things fresh right now. But I've definitely fallen in love with the writing process. I used to say I was a speaker who occasionally wrote. 4 books in about 10 years. Like you're not Stephen King when you're producing at that level. But now I'm embracing the idea that I am actually a writer because I'm actually loving the process and I'm loving digging into that. I can't wait to see what these characters are going to do next.
Yeah, because they do say, like, even nonfiction, sure, they talk about truth, right? But then there's truth with a big T, which is explored in fiction, right? So like even in fantasy novels or sci-fi novels, they're exploring truths, but with a big T, like the ideas, the concepts. So I do feel like there's a place for, I think there is a place to explore some of the ideas that you've probably explored in your nonfiction work in the fiction work. And I even see that even in the first few chapters of you going into like, how are these like how's land being bought and what's kind of the dealings like.
Yeah.
So I
Thank
could
you.
say, oh, I can see some of Peter's like urban development sleeping in here, you know.
Can't help it. But in some ways, like the way I want to talk about cities, I want to make it feel real. You know, there, San Francisco feels like a character to me. There, and of course, if I'm writing about a city, I'm writing about it. I have this urbanist sort of perspective as well. So I'm glad it kind of comes through, and I think it serves me well, sort of in this particular sort of conversation. Yeah, but I'm glad you noticed that. Thank you.
Yeah. As
You
far
have
as like,
top five cities that you like?
okay, oh man, that's a hard question. Oh,
That is a hard question, and it kind of, it depends on the day also and where you were last. I have absolutely fallen back in love with San Francisco because I'm thinking about it there. I've been out there twice just in the last less than 12 months there. I love where I live, which is a good thing. I live in St. Petersburg, Florida, which is an amazing city. For a Florida city, it's by far the most walkable city there. And I'll make the argument that it's the best city in Florida, there. So there's two at least.
Yes.
I do have a soft spot for college towns. There's something special about college towns. There's an energy about that, multi-generational. There's usually good bookstores, good comic book stores, good board game stores too. So those are important to me. So yeah. What about you guys? Favorite cities?
That's a tough one.
I like Yokohama.
Okay.
Also
Well,
like,
yeah.
go ahead.
Hopefully you like where you live. I think that's important, or where you are. The thing about city love that I say all the time is city love is not monogamous. You should
Right.
love more than one place.
Yes.
You really should, because travel is good for the soul there, but finding a way to connect with the places that we go to, that's important.
Yes.
So yeah, non-monogamous city love.
That's very good. I do like where I live. I live in Atwater Village, which is a small part of Los Angeles itself.
Mhm.
So it's very walkable. There are a lot of stores around and lots of restaurants.
It makes a huge difference. It's hard to connect with your city when you're driving 45 miles an hour.
Yes.
When you're
Right.
walking, riding a bike, a one wheel, a scooter, something like that, it definitely feels different.
I do notice in Asia, in America, I'm always driving. In Asia, like I lived in Tainan and Taiwan before, and then I'm living in Seoul, and I take the train and I bike everywhere. And it does change the connection, I feel like. It makes it more like I'm actually walking through crowds or walking through people. I'm not having this metallic barrier between me and like other humans. Yeah.
Exactly. I said in my first book, I called the car a prophylactic that keeps you from connecting with your city. And it's funny you mentioned I've spoken Tainan. There.
Oh, really? Okay.
That was a city that was literally overrun by scooters.
Yeah.
It was a problem, man. And I remember seeing that there was actually a municipal service that was coming around, and it was finding scooters that had basically been lost or abandoned and dumping them into trucks because there were so many scooters that were there. I mean, somebody leaves it there for a week or something like that. I think they're coming around. It's like it's into the truck. But scooters everywhere.
That's a big problem with Tainan, and then like Taipei as well. It's just like the traffic accident rate is just not good, compared to like other comparable countries in Asia. Yeah, it's tough. So yeah, we before we finish, we generally like to finish off. Dan, did you have any other follow-up questions?
No.
Yeah. No. To finish off, we like to ask our guests, what's something that you're doing to stay balanced? We're called Yin and Yang podcast, kind of like a play on yin and yang. And what's something that Peter does that, with work, life, personal life? How do you keep balance in your own life? Yeah.
It's a good question. Right now, I got married last year.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. We're very happy. We're both passionate about we have hobbies. My wife is an incredible painter and an incredible seamstress. She loves to sew. She's making clothes. It's amazing stuff there. And I am a board game nerd. I love complex, thinky board games, the kind of stuff that really gets you immersed in a particular sort of challenge, like you're building a company or building a nation state, something like that there. So I find that is my sort of therapy as well. I still love to work out, and I live in Florida, so it's pretty easy to get out and walk every day. There. So finding that sort of balance and just the intellectual, it's like put down the book, turn off the TV, and go and think about something else for a while. So that seems to be pretty good advice for finding some balance.
What's the most recent board game that you're like really fixated on?
Believe it or not, there was one called Barrage, which is about hydroelectric power. It's like really, yeah, it kind of is. So there's amazing board games around all kinds of stuff. I think actually my favorite is one called Terraforming Mars, which is about these mega corporations turning Mars into a habitable planet over like generations and whatnot. But it's something a little different, a little bit more sophisticated than Risk and Monopoly.
Right.
Those are good games, but
I heard someone say that this is like the golden age of board games.
It absolutely is. The last 10, 15 years, board games have gone through the roof. There's probably board game cafes. I know there's board game cafes in Los Angeles. I'm sure there's board game cafes there in Japan as well, because board games are, I love, video games are cool, but board games are different because board games are social. It requires us to sit at a table together, there. And that I think was the component that is sort of missing. And granted, you can play Fortnite, with, wired up with your friends all around the world, but it's not the same as being in the same room and sitting around the board, having a cup of coffee, having a beer, whatever it is. There, because I think it's that social connection that's made board games sort of come back to the forefront, that they're sort of an antidote to some of the other things that we've done, to ourselves, and creating this sort of high stress, sometimes, occasionally toxic environment. It's a good antidote to that.
Right. I think there's probably people who are very hungry for that kind of human interaction after, what we went through. Yeah. With the pandemic. Yeah.
That's absolutely true. I mean, that's something I've seen, and I've been talking about that in my sort of city work, is that there was a pent up demand and a pent up energy. People were reminded how important it is to actually be able to connect with each other, and how important something as simple as like green space in a park was. Like, people always said they loved the park, but they didn't realize how important the park was until they couldn't go to the mall, they couldn't go to the theater, they couldn't go to the restaurants. Like, where else are you going to go? Like, oh, let's go to the park. And it's like, oh, this is kind of cool. This is important. And I think COVID was an amazing reminder in many ways of the things that actually are probably more important than we believed in the past. So.
Right, things we took for granted, and it's like just walking, and just hanging out with a friend, or
it's the silver lining in a really shitty cloud, right? So,
and you got a book out of it too, so that's good.
I got 2 books out of it.
You got 2 books out of it, so
yeah, I did the 10-year anniversary of my first book. It came out in 2021. That was a lot of fun to go back and revisit that and revise it and update it. And then the second one was this new book, Hunter's Point.
Awesome. Cool. So we have a language corner that we do at the end. I know. So I can start. Right now I'm learning Japanese, and a phrase that I like that I learned recently was hankoki. Hankoki is basically rebellious phase. So I practice jujitsu, and I was talking with with my senpai who gives me a ride home. And he was saying his son's going through a hankoki, going through a rebellious phase. I was like, oh, cool. Yeah. It's like, yeah, it's a little bit late for him. His son's like late teens. And I said, oh man, for me, my rebellious phase was in my 20s. So I'm even later. So I thought that was a fun phrase, hankoki. So it's like hanko means like to rebel, and then ki means like a period of time. So that's a phrase I learned recently.
I'm writing that down. Yeah.
Okay. Any phrases or vocab that I know, Peter, you're a fiction writer now, so you're probably pondering words a lot now these days. Yeah.
I should have something in my back pocket around that. I don't have anything at the moment. So
I do notice I noticed in your book that you do introduce, I like how in your book you do introduce like Japanese phrases, but like in a very natural setting, in a natural way, So like irashaimase, with the character welcoming back Katz. Yeah. So like for that, did you have to revisit some of your Japanese minor
Yeah, I
studies?
mean,
Yeah.
it's when you start putting yourself in that situation, it's like, it's like I remember more than I probably think I do. It's like, and you start, it's like, oh yeah, the words kind of come back, and concepts. I was just, I'll say this, I was writing something last night, and it's in the second book, and I revisited the on and giri,
Oh,
the
okay.
the obligation that we take on voluntarily, and that which is sort of required of us, and I was explaining how the difference between the two, that on is like, oh, of course I will do that for you, but giri is something that's like, it could be heavy, there, and it's felt and it's experienced in a different way, but it's one of those, like, only the Japanese would have multiple words for obligation to express sort of how it actually manifests. So yeah, on and giri.
I'm writing that down. That's interesting. Yeah.
On
Dan,
and giri. Yeah.
GIR. Okay. Dan, do you have any phrases or things that you like recently, or yeah?
Oh, there's a word in Japanese called shippai. Shippai is like, you kind of like, it's kind of foiled or ruined or screwed. Very hard to like translate. Like shippai shita is like, it didn't happen kind of thing. Like if you want something and it's like, oh, I lost it. I can't even like
It sounds like a swear word, actually.
Yes.
Shippai?
Yeah,
No.
yeah.
I mean, swear words in Japanese are like kuso or something like that.
Right. Go die or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, kuso is like
kuso means shit, I guess, right? Yeah.
yes.
So,
So yeah.
baka.
Baka, stupid, yeah.
Yeah.
Aho. But
Aho.
aho. Did you know that there's like a new word of baka? The young kids use this word called, do you know what sus means? I'm learning these from my kids.
Sus? Oh, like something
As in
is sus. Oh,
suspect, right?
Suspect.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yeah. So there, I guess out of the games, video games, there's a new word called sussy baka, like suspect like, but baka like in stupid in the Japanese one, sussy baka.
Sussy baka.
Sussy baka.
Interesting.
Yeah. My kids started using it. I was like, where'd you guys get that from? Do you guys even know what that means? They go, I don't know, but everyone's using it. I was like, and then they went to go and found out it was like sus as like sussy, very suspect like, and baka meaning like stupid. I was like, oh, they took it from Japanese. Why did they do that?
Well, that's cool. I mean, it's a great example of how language evolves,
Yes.
there. And yeah, very
Cool.
good.
Awesome. All right, Peter, thank you so much. I know it's midnight there. You probably gotta get to bed. Yeah.
It's a weekend, so I think I'm
Okay,
cool.
good.
But,
Yeah. I did have one thought. I just came up, like the thought of language. So because of the setting, did you have to go revisit sort of like how did they speak during that time? Well, what are some of the vocab of the Issei or the Nisei generation? Like, did you have to go do a lot of research to that, or? Yeah.
Well, I had to be conscious of not using like sort of idioms or phrases that we would use today.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe a little bit more formal language, all that. Yeah, I was trying to be conscious of that, but I was not going to be like slavish to the idea of everything having to be perfectly in tune for that particular time period.
Got it.
I think conscious of it, but I wasn't going to be so precious about it. It's like, oh well, they never use that. But you know what? The one thing I will say that is weird that we kind of take for granted is the ability to just rapidly communicate with people. I mean, in storytelling today, it's very easy for character A to talk to character B and move the story along that way. Landlines. I mean, that was there. And no answering machines. Like, how do people? Yeah. So, but somehow we have to keep the story moving along. But yeah, that is maybe the hardest thing, less the language thing, but the technology that was available to them at the time. That was you gotta like, okay, how are we gonna do this?
Yeah, switch it to like, okay, what did my dad do? Or yeah.
What we're doing here right now, this is like magic.
This is magic. Yeah.
Amazing. So.
Awesome. All right. Anything else? So look out for Hunter's Point, which should be out by the time, which is out now, and will be out by the time this podcast is released. Please check it out. It's a bestseller on Kindle for the under the Asian American category, I believe. Is that correct? Yeah.
I am now apparently an Amazon bestselling author. Hooray!
Very nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. And anything else you want to plug? You wrote another book in COVID, and you have a sequel in the works. Anything else you want to plug? Yeah.
Well, you can check out my stuff at peterkageyama.com. And then if you want to look for my nonfiction stuff, you're interested in cities, my book, the book I'm best known for is For the Love of Cities. And the newest one is For the Love of Cities Revisited. It was the 10-year anniversary edition of that. And yeah, so.
Awesome.
cool.
Great. And then
Awesome.
moving forward, are we expecting more fiction, nonfiction?
I think
what do you, yeah.
Fiction, yes. Like I said, I'm well into the sequel. I'd like to strike while the iron's hot. I think maybe by the end of the year, we'll have a second novel
Oh,
in the
wow.
Sakamoto series out. So,
Okay.
Very nice.
Awesome.
yeah, I'm excited
Great.
about that.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Peter. And this was a great conversation. I think we covered a lot, and it was great to learn about the background of your story and about yourself as well. Yeah.
Thank you guys. Much appreciated. Love what you
Thanks,
guys do.
Peter.
All right.
All right. Thank you. Take care. All right.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.